he knows, right, these have the ammonium nitrate. They should be classified as class 1 explosives. And he's extremely concerned about what could happen if one of these trucks were to get in an accident, right? Because you have basically the equivalent of tons of bombs on the back of that.
Welcome to Go No Go. I'm John Bruner.
And I'm Alex Howe.
Go No Go is a podcast about design, engineering, manufacturing, and the calls that can make or break great products. And it's brought to you by Lumafield, which is a company that makes AI-enabled manufacturing intelligence software that gives engineers total confidence in the products that they ship. This podcast happens in 3 different segments. Some episodes we interview a key figure from manufacturing and product development. Some segments we talk about recent news. And in this section, Reconstructions, we go back in history and revisit a key failure in the history of engineering. Sitting in front of us on our desk is a pretty threatening thing. What is this, Alex?
It's a Takata Airbag. It's got a Volkswagen logo on it, but it is a Takata Airbag that was manufactured in Mexico. The
key plant at the center of the Takata Airbag recall disaster, no less.
Yeah, I really hate that this is on this table right now.
I'm sorry, Alex is flinching a little bit as I hold this airbag. This was remarkably easy to buy. I bought it on eBay a couple of years ago so that we could CT scan it and see what's inside. I don't enjoy holding it either, so I'm going to put it down. But this has been kind of haunting our office for the last couple of years.
Well, what I hate about this airbag, I watched the documentary recently about the Takata Airbags ticking time bomb. There's a lot of really unfortunate, graphic imagery of injuries sustained from these airbags. But so when I realized this was a Takata, I wanted to look up, is this a recalled unit? And I actually could not find a single way to identify if it's recalled or not. All the recall sites want you to enter the VIN for the vehicle, but this is not in a vehicle. So we have the PN, but I am unable to take the serial number and figure out if this is the bad one or not.
That's astonishing because there is a huge trade in replacement airbags and secondhand airbags. When cars get into accidents, you need to replace the airbag module if it's inflated, or if a car needs to get scrapped for other reasons, the airbag module can be taken out and put in a different car. So these are quite widely traded, and the fact that the recall is tied entirely to the VIN rather than the serial number on the airbag really doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it looks like there was an effort to make a website to be able to look up the serial number, freepartcheck.com, but when you try to go to the website, it doesn't work. So I don't know if it just never went live or was taken down. I spent a lot of time trying to figure it out and I couldn't do it.
Maybe they've decided that their work is done. And what we have here is an orphaned Takata airbag that may or may not be extremely dangerous.
Yeah, just a month ago, Fiat Chrysler issued more do not drive warnings for vehicles that continue to have these Takata airbags in them.
This has been the largest and costliest recall in history. It has spanned just about every major automaker. And it continues because not everyone who has one of these airbags has brought it into a shop to get replaced.
There was a Wall Street Journal piece that we talked about, I think, on episode 5 of Go No Go, that covered how about 1/3 of automotive recalls are never brought in for service, regardless of the severity, whether it's brakes failing or airbags killing people or just your seatbelt buckle is a little loose. There is a solid proportion of people that won't bring their car in to fix it.
In a weird way, it's a testament to the reliability of modern cars that these things don't get replaced, because service shops will check your vehicle identification number against recall databases and figure out what needs to be replaced. And I think they like doing the work because they get reimbursed by the automaker for the recall replacement work. So it's in their interest to check your VIN, do the work, and then bill the automaker. But I think what's happened is that cars have become so reliable that people don't bring them into a shop as often as they used to. So let's talk about how airbags actually work. And we can use this terrifying Takata airbag on the table in front of us as an illustration. We CT scanned this after purchasing it. And so we have an illustration here, which if you're watching this episode of the podcast on video, you'll see. But if not, you can check out the link in your show notes and explore this scan yourself. So first we can sort of crop into this airbag and see the coiled bag itself. This is, tightly wound inside the enclosure of the steering wheel. And then when we strip away the less dense materials, we can sort of isolate the igniter a little bit. This looks like two different cavities. This looks like two different enclosures. And what do you see inside them?
Yeah, when we move to kind of a slice view, we can see that they have two different cavities with what look like pellet materials inside. And these are basically two stages of igniters.
This is an incredible assembly, and it's the kind of thing that you would not want to disassemble to inspect. It's pretty dangerous to open up. They started to become common in the 1990s in the US after a very long series of back and forth arguments between regulators and automakers. Seatbelts had been introduced pretty widely in the 1960s, so this was seen as the next major evolution, and also something that could address the problem of drivers and passengers not wearing seatbelts. It's a supplementary restraint system that helps you avoid death or serious injury, regardless of wearing a seatbelt.
Yeah, I saw you shared an article like how to spot a fake airbag, and you mentioned like early prototypes of airbags. Like, I'm curious about those.
Yeah, in those early airbags, there was actually a tube with a ball in it, and a sufficiently hard impact would cause the ball to dislodge in the tube and roll down it and hit a contact that would cause the airbag to go off. Now they're much more sophisticated sets of, MEMS devices and so on that can detect a crash. But the way that an airbag works is that it has what's called an inflator, which normally would be called a package of explosives, really what it is. But there's kind of a euphemism in the automotive world. You call these things inflators. They're full of a chemical that decomposes into a gas very, very rapidly and inflates a fabric bag very, very, very quickly. So within 40 milliseconds from impact to full inflation of the bag.
Yeah, when we look at the origin of Takata, it was founded in 1933 originally as a textile company, making parachute lifelines. It's in 1988 where they began manufacturing airbags, and by 2014 they have about 20% of the global market. Yeah, Takata developed this inflator chemistry that was really focused on ammonium nitrate. And people might be more familiar with ammonium nitrate for its role in fertilizers as well as in terrorism and bomb development.
That's right. The chemistry inside airbags has gone through a bit of evolution. First generation airbags used a chemical called sodium azide, which produces nitrogen gas, which is fine, but they also produce as a byproduct particles that can retain heat. And so there were a lot of reports from these early airbags of passengers and drivers getting really serious burns after the airbags inflated. Also, sodium azide is very toxic. So manufacturers wanted to move on to something that would be less toxic and less dangerous during deployment, and landed on tetrazole, which is a synthetic compound that is also considerably more expensive. And that was the generation that Takata fatefully kind of wanted to move on from in order to reduce the cost of the propellant in the airbags.
Yeah, the phase stabilized ammonium nitrate, which is the primary propellant in the Takata airbag, runs several dollars cheaper per unit than the alternatives used by competitors. In a vehicle, right, it's so cost sensitive because it's an assembly stack up of so many elements that a few dollars here and there is really attractive.
That's right. And ammonium nitrate is a very, very high volume chemical. It is the classic kind of fertilizer explosive hybrid. The development of the synthesis process for ammonium nitrate is one of these watershed moments in the advancement of civilization, because it made it possible to achieve widespread high output agriculture. At the same time, this is a chemical that you hear about all the time being in things like terrorist bombs or terrible industrial accidents. So from a cost perspective, it was appealing to Takata for using in airbags, but it was not a very stable propellant.
Yeah, and so it's in around the early 2000s that Takata starts to become aware that some of their PSAN-based inflators, the phase-stabilized ammonium nitrate, they're failing to meet the automaker specifications, and they're failing during testing. They're rupturing. So they, allegedly they falsify their test data and they continue selling the airbags. There's a documented instance where a former employee confirms that a failed test result at a Georgia facility was given new barcodes to prevent tracking.
So this was not only poor quality control in the Takata manufacturing facility, but deceitful quality control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as early as 2001, we see like Honda and Acura vehicles being equipped with what will later be identified as like the alpha inflators, a subset that's found to be particularly dangerous as they age. And as we move into 2004 to 2007, we begin to see some early rupture incidents and injuries happening, particularly in Honda vehicles.
So how did Takata respond to those?
So the first recall they issued was in 2008, November 2008. That's their first kind of acknowledgement that there may be a problem, but this recall is really small. It's only 3,940 vehicles. And so NHTSA begins to question, right, why was that recall so limited? So in August 2009, they start a formal inquiry to kind of dig deeper into this problem. But the company, of course, is like trying to limit the spread of this because recalls are extremely expensive for these suppliers. The stakes really increase in May 2009 when Ashley Parham, an 18-year-old, dies in a minor fender bender in a high school parking lot. This was an accident that should have been completely survivable, but the Takata inflator in her 2001 Honda Accord ruptures, and the shrapnel unfortunately leads to her death. This is the first confirmed U.S. fatality related to this product. So
in this incident, the airbag should have gone off, and it did, but it went off with an explosion that was too violent, that was beyond the design intent of the airbag.
And then you have the metal of the packaging, like basically becomes shrapnel that lacerates the passenger.
Right.
And we continue to see more and more accidents. Later in 2009, Gurjit Rathore becomes the second documented U.S. fatality. And in 2013, automakers start to begin larger scale recalls. So the first wave of that affects 3.6 million, and it's all tracked to Takata's Monclova plant in Mexico.
What was their initial thinking as to what could be causing this issue?
Yeah, they first publicly attribute the defect to moisture exposure. Like, oh, this chemical, the PSAN, right, as it's exposed to moisture over time, it degrades and becomes more dangerous. So they kind of solve this with a second generation airbag that includes a desiccant. This first wave of larger recalls impacts 3.6 million airbags, and they're all attributed to the Takata Monclova plant in Mexico, which is where this airbag on the table in front of us was manufactured. So don't love that.
Yeah, I'm keeping my laptop between myself and the airbag for now.
But yeah, so they attribute this defect to moisture. They're saying, like, as moisture is getting into the PSAN over time as the airbag ages, it's making it more dangerous. So they initially recalled just those airbags that don't have the desiccant. So that's about 30 to 40 million inflators. That's what it gets expanded to in 2016, all Takata units that don't have the desiccant. And the Department of Transportation also levies a $200 million civil fine against Takata, which is the largest in U.S. automotive history at that point.
So this is when the scale of the issue begins to be recognized. And it is fair to say that moisture may play a role here, but the issue with the ammonium nitrate propellant is actually more fundamental. Ammonium nitrate is a crystalline substance that has multiple crystal phases, and it can transition between them as it cycles between hot summer days and cold nights. And as it does that, it can expand and contract and develop cracks in the crystals, which increases their surface area. And if you think about what it takes to create the perfect airbag inflation, something that happens in just a few milliseconds without exploding too violently and injuring the passenger or the driver, but still doing it fast enough to be helpful, that's a very fine line. So the explosion, the inflation has to happen within very, very narrow margins. When the ammonium nitrate cracks and its surface area increases, that leads to faster and more erratic explosions. So moisture may play a role in that. It does absorb moisture from the air, and so in very hot, humid environments, it could degrade even faster. There were some signs that in really hot and humid regions, the ammonium nitrate could become compromised within as little as 6 years.
That's why some Takata employees really pushed back on limiting the recall to only the airbags that didn't have the desiccant, because they didn't really feel that the desiccant was sufficient, especially given that cars have such a long lifespan.
So you were explaining that Takata has started at this point to recognize the magnitude of what's going on, as have regulators. What happens next?
Yeah, so in January 2017, the DOJ charges 3 Takata executives with wire fraud. So Takata Corporation agrees to plead guilty. They pay $1 billion, $850 million to automakers, $125 million to victims, which seems a little low. $25 million as a federal fine. And later that year, they file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So they're acquired by Key Safety Systems, which rebrands as Joyson Safety Systems. And they continue to issue kind of recall notices into the future as they kind of absorb this customer base.
A little bit like the incident we discussed in our last episode with a reconstruction around the ValueJet crash in 1996. The brand at this point was unsalvageable, and the business as well. There's just very little trust left in Takata, and it has to dissolve and sort of get absorbed for parts.
Yeah, and since this bankruptcy back in 2017, right, that's almost 10 years ago now, there have continued to be more and more issues still with these airbags. So in 2018, they confirmed the bankruptcy plan. 2019, there's another recall for a separate class of Takata inflators, non-azide driver inflators, so those are distinct from the main PSAN recall. In 2023, Honda issues a do not drive warning for several of their 2001 to 2003 Honda and Acura models. They determined the rupture rate on those units could be as high as 50%.
Whoa. So 50% of airbag deployments could result in a really serious rupture.
Mm-hmm.
That is incredible.
Yeah, especially because they've aged so much at that point that the likelihood of it being a devastating event is significantly higher.
This is an interesting recall in that it is the aging of these products that causes them to become even more dangerous. So even though the fraction of airbags that are out there is sort of dwindling, the ones that are still around are becoming even more dangerous.
Just early this year, in February 2026, Stellantis issued a do not drive warning for about 225,000 additional vehicles. So that is for models built as recently as 2016. So even though it's like 20 years since the first recall notice, vehicles are still being added to the Takata action.
That summarizes kind of the design and engineering story and the corporate story. But when we look at these failures, we often see that there's a level of cultural failure that underlies them. So this entire disaster has killed about 28 people in the US alone. And beyond the tragedy of those lives lost, this is also an automaker's worst nightmare. You have this extremely complex supply chain going into any modern car. There are thousands of parts. No automaker actually produces all the components that go into their cars. Modern automakers really depend on these tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers to build up the assemblies that then go into a fully assembled car.
These automakers also don't have a huge swath of suppliers to choose from for certain specialty components like this, right? And that's why you find these Takata airbags. They've been installed in everything from Honda Civics, like Ferraris and McLarens, right? It's not even a very high-end car can have this kind of same problem.
That's right. And automakers really rely on the expertise of these suppliers as well. Designing and manufacturing airbags is very, very specialized. Of course, the big automotive OEMs have their own experts in safety systems and so on, but really they're just specifying the performance that they require from their suppliers and then relying on their suppliers to do the underlying engineering that goes into meeting those requirements.
Right. They see that they can save a few dollars, which, really adds up for them. And they see that Takata has shipped so much, right? I think they had 20% market share at some point. They're used by almost half of all automakers. And so you think it's a safe choice, but ultimately you buy cheap and it ends up being very expensive because you have to pay for this recall.
That's right. And in this case, the failures are a really interesting combination of several different kind of organizational and managerial failure modes. In some cases, like we discussed a moment ago, there is actual misrepresentation on Takata's part around their safety and manufacturing quality processes. So airbags that have failed tests getting a new barcode and shipped to an automaker.
You also see the incentives companies might have to lean on their IP portfolio, even if it's imperfect.
So Honda was one of the most deeply impacted automakers by this recall. Takata and Honda actually have a relationship that goes back a long time. So there should have been a lot of mutual trust between these companies, but instead managers kind of tended to obfuscate and bury the issues.
That might have also pushed kind of both sides to be willing to look the other way to just try to move the partnership forward and get parts out the door.
That's right. It's hard to really discipline a supplier of yours when they're also a critical business partner. So
right. You've tried to make them your supplier, maybe to expand your supply chain or drive better costs.
That's right. Or there's an instruction from above to, find a way to grow together.
I recently watched a documentary from 2003 called Ticking Time Bomb: The Truth Behind Takata Airbags. And they talk about in this documentary how since Takata had developed this novel inflator technology, they really wanted to leverage that, right, as like a differentiator. It's something they own, they don't have to license. And that can kind of skew the motivation towards that solution, even if it's not necessarily the best or the safest solution.
That's right.
The kind of protagonist in this documentary, John Keller, he talks about working in a Takata lab and actually seeing a technician who had been injured after conducting a test that had exploded and lacerated them and left this gory blood trail. And so he puts together a report. I think there are some maybe disagreements about exactly the whistleblower narrative at Takata, but like very early on, like he was aware of having witnessed an injury in the lab and felt that the information he put together was really suppressed and not addressed properly.
Is this something that you would characterize as a normal accident? Like we talked about in our value jet reconstruction episode, something that's extremely hard to control, or is this a different kind of cultural or managerial issue?
I think this is maybe more an example of like an organizational failure, like we kind of saw with the Challenger and Diane Bond, the book that she had written on that incident. People were kind of aware of the risks, but because it hadn't been like as devastating as it could be, they were willing to kind of push forward what they were willing to accept.
This is a disaster that unrolled across several different countries as well. Takata is a Japanese auto supplier. Some of their plants are in the US. The one that was at the center of this disaster was in Mexico. How was Takata organized and was there an issue there?
Yeah, you see in Takata kind of the promotion of people that maybe didn't have the right expertise to properly evaluate the dangers. For example, you have a VP that is responsible for both the mechanical design and the inflator chemistry. And I think it would be challenging for any one person to be properly versed to fully comprehend the implications of both. So it might be easier to dismiss the importance of one over the other. The other issue with Takata being a Japanese company, right, you have these executives for whom airbags were kind of a newer product line. It's not that they had a really long history of providing this type of product or understanding of what the ramifications could be if it went wrong. So of course they're thinking, we've developed this novel technology. This is how we're going to make our play into the market. They had a huge deal lined up with Honda. And the feeling was that accepting the reports that were put together about the potential hazards would compromise their timeline and that they might not be able to get in and establish that strong foothold in the market.
This is a characteristic that you see in a lot of these failures is just an organizational bias toward pushing forward and hitting the deadline and not disappointing your superiors or your customers.
Yeah, and assuming that what will go wrong will usually go right.
That's right. And in this case, they very much disappointed their customers. I mean, dozens of automakers. There's a reason that civil judgment you mentioned, $1 billion, that the bulk of that went to the automakers. They suffered most of the reputational and brand damage that arose from this. They had to actually execute the recall. So this was extremely costly for Takata's customers.
What's also fascinating about the Takata story is the other side of the recall. So this documentary, Ticking Time Bomb, it actually primarily focuses on what happens to the recalled airbags. So John Keller, who had previously worked at Takata, had been aware of the issues there. When the recalls are issued, he goes and visits some auto shops to discover, how are you handling these airbags as they're being removed from the vehicles? He learns that they're taking the airbags out, they're putting them in cardboard boxes, saran wrapping them onto a pallet and shoving them onto a truck.
Wow. This has echoes of our value jet discussion from a few episodes ago.
Yeah, exactly. And he finds that these airbags, they have been categorized as class 9 miscellaneous, non-hazardous. But he knows, right, these have the ammonium nitrate. They should be classified as class 1 explosives. And he's extremely concerned about what could happen if one of these trucks were to get in an accident, right? Because you have basically the equivalent of tons of bombs on the back of that. So he goes and buys, I think 5,000 airbags in his basement. He's got a very patient family that just is Yeah.
I wouldn't do that to myself, much less my family. But
this is the 5,000 airbags in the basement that are probably dangerous. And he goes through all of these tests to prove that the airbags should not be shipped just like through regular freight. They should be shipped as a hazardous material. He gets like people that are approved by the regulators, like witness his tests so they can be certified. But he finds that he's continuously rejected. It's actually crazy to see that he went through all of this effort proving how dangerous the airbags are, even when they're removed from the vehicle. And yet they continue today to be shipped as Class 9 miscellaneous.
it is remarkably easy to buy airbags as a consumer on the internet. This airbag that's in front of us is something that I ordered from eBay a few years ago. I think it arrived by UPS ground shipping, and it's ready to go in a car. And related to that, actually, is a pretty significant problem with counterfeit airbags as well.
Yeah. One thing that's referenced in the same documentary, there's a woman, Stephanie Erdman, who was injured by Takata Airbag. Like, she was almost blinded in one eye. She had really severe lacerations. Those images of her were really pervasive on the media when her accident happened. And she said she went to get her car serviced, and they're like, oh yeah, and there's like an airbag recall, but you don't really need to worry about that. She's like, hey, do you have internet on your computer? Mm-hmm. And so she has them Google her, and they see those photos, and she's like, yeah, like,
wow, these
actually are very important. But even the people performing the recalls, they're like not aware of the danger that like they're in or that the parts pose. They don't necessarily take it super seriously.
Wow, this is incredible. So the first reports of problems emerged between maybe 2004 and 2007. They gradually made their way to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The first death from one of these Takata airbags came in 2009, but the major recalls were launched in 2013. So that took a while to sort of work its way through the regulatory process and really result in direct action from regulators and from Takata. What was happening on the regulatory side?
Yeah, well, some advice Takata had received was to kind of establish better relationships in Washington. So basically bringing on a lot of regulators and former regulators on as paid consultants to kind of improve their standing in that community. And that really smoothed the path for them to have a little less pressure from the regulators themselves. Something that's also well documented is kind of the revolving door between government officials and industry. I think the saying is people go into government to do good and then they leave government to do well. So we see, for example, in the regulators today, I think it's a former Takata exec that John Keller was presenting his case to.
Interesting. So despite the slowness of the recall process, it's actually been quite successful.
Yeah, 98% of recalled vehicles have been repaired as of early 2026 per NHTSA. And that's an incredible rate. Like I mentioned earlier, that Wall Street Journal article cites that a third of recalls are never completed. So this is an incredible rate. The problem is the issue at hand is so dangerous. So that remaining 2% still translates to over 1 million vehicles on the road today.
Incredible. Yeah, the volumes that we're talking about here are remarkable. I'm always amazed when we talk about the automotive industry, just how many units are involved in anything.
Yeah, and the duration of time that those units are on the road, right? They're subjected to all kinds of conditions that may not have been really understood at the time of development.
Yeah, absolutely. The two products that always strike me for their life cycles are cars and phones, and they're kind of at the opposite ends of the life cycle range. But like, an iPhone costs $800 or something, and you use it 6 hours a day, every single day for 2 years. It's like this incredible value and remarkably long when you think about it. And I think the only other thing that's comparable in our day-to-day lives would be a car, which is much, much more expensive and lasts 20 years instead. But you can park it under the hot sun, every single day in Arizona, and it basically works. And I'm always struck too by how good old cars look now compared to how they looked like 20 years ago. Back in the 90s, if you saw a 20-year-old car, you knew that it was a real dumpy 20-year-old car, just like peeling paint and leather falling apart and, things dragging under it. Now you see 20-year-old cars all the time and they look like quite good. I think there's been a lot of progress in not only the reliability of cars, but also the durability of the like cosmetic finishes and things like that.
My first car moving back from college was a 90s Honda Civic I bought for $1,200.
Nice.
And then I sold it like 4 years later for $1,200.
Wow. Absolutely no depreciation.
It was incredible because I was like, oh, this costs half as much as my laptop. But like, I'm like riding this around.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
When I was in high school, a good friend of mine had a car that was not like that. It was a Dodge Colt from 1979, which at the time was about 20 years old as well. And you could see the road pass under you through the floor of the car. It had been corroded from below. That car actually was, the badge on the back said Colt, imported for Dodge, because it was an example of one of these very early partnerships between a U.S. automaker and a Japanese automaker. In this case, Mitsubishi. It was a rebadged Mitsubishi of some sort. But I doubt you could get any money for that car at the end. That was one of the ones you probably had to like pay a junkyard to take.
That's terrifying. You could see the road.
Yeah. Anyway, now I'm always paying attention to like what look like 20-year-old cars and marveling that they look so good. So a question that this prompts that we often find ourselves asking in these reconstruction episodes, could this happen today the same way?
I think companies are still incentivized today to maybe attempt to pull this off. What's different is the availability of maybe more information. I think companies are more connected than ever before. They're able to do a lot of their own inspection in a way that wasn't possible in the past. For example, right, with our CT scanner, the airbags are something that are quite dangerous, that you're not going to take that apart in your own lab, but you can CT scan it in the assembly and at least like draw a few of your own conclusions, especially if you're starting to have suspicions about one of your suppliers.
That's right. And the relationship between, automotive OEMs and their suppliers and similar relationships in many industries has really evolved and become more sophisticated as well. Technology has made it possible for customers to kind of like reach up into their supply chains and get more visibility. Software is often integrated between, OEMs and their suppliers so that they can be more aware of quality in their products as it moves through the factory floor. So it's becoming more common for different companies that are partners in this type of thing to have visibility into each other's manufacturing processes. And that's a good thing. On the other hand, supply chains have continued to become more complex and more global. Sorry, I know that's a huge revelation that no one has thought about before. You can call me Thomas Friedman. Anyway, this introduces a new set of challenges. For instance, airbag counterfeiting is an enormous problem. The Wall Street Journal did an investigation here too and found that a really large fraction of airbags that are available through consumer marketplaces like eBay are outright counterfeits.
That's incredible to think that there is enough of a demand for that to even be worth making.
Well, again, cars last a really long time now. And after they're out of warranty, you just kind of go to whatever garage gives you the best quote on some sort of upgrade or repair, especially if you've been in a crash and you need to have your airbag unit replaced. A lot of people are incentivized to look for a low-cost solution. So there are airbags that are, unauthorized, third-party airbags. That's one thing. But then there are also airbags that are counterfeits that misrepresent the real manufacturer of the airbag. And that kind of counterfeiting is visible in an X-ray CT scan, but is not really visible on visual inspection.
Yeah, I guess with the more global distribution of all these suppliers, right? They might have factories in multiple countries and they might have distributors to then like move those parts into other countries. And so there might even be more opportunities for bad actors to enter kind of the valid supply chain as well.
That's right. So what should car owners be doing to make sure that they're not driving a bomb around?
Yeah, I think, people make fun of us online that unfortunately our solution is always to pay more money for the parts you buy.
That's right.
Whether it's your replacement automotive parts or your batteries, right? Unfortunately, if it seems like too good of a deal to be true, we always find in the CT scans that it is too good a deal to be true and it's going to have real hazards for you later on. You buy cheap now and it's expensive later when you are dealing with the consequences.
That's right. Consumers don't have industrial CT scanners. We recognize that. But reputable manufacturers and distributors do. And if you stick with them, you can hopefully trust that they'll have properly inspected the things that you're buying.
Yeah. And the other thing is to always take your recall notices seriously. I think we all get those letters in the mail. They can kind of pile up. It can be troublesome to go to the dealer or shop to get it fixed. But you really don't know when the circumstances might happen where the worst case situation happens to you. So it's really important to check your VIN, make sure there's no recalls outstanding, and take care of it.
Well, if listeners would like to learn more about this, you can check out the show notes that are attached to this podcast episode. In the video version of this, if you're watching that, you're seeing us with this airbag. We've also walked through some CT scans of it so you can see kind of what these things look like on the inside. And with that, we'll wrap up. If you'd like to contact us, please send us an email at gng@lumafield.com. We always love hearing from our listeners about what's on your minds and what you find interesting. Go No Go is brought to you by Lumafield, which makes a manufacturing intelligence platform that gives engineers and manufacturers complete confidence in the products that they ship. You can learn more about Lumafield at lumafield.com. And there you can also explore the CT scans that we've been showing of airbags. We'll provide those links in the show notes as well. For Go No Go, I'm John Bruner.
And I'm Alex Howe.
Go No Go is brought to you by Lumafield, which was founded to upgrade manufacturing. You can learn more at lumafield.com. Go No Go is produced by Austin Carter and edited by Brian Tran, with additional assistance from Eric Petralia.